right, I'll call this work session to order. We'll start with introductions. For some reason, no one wants to sit to my right today. That's great. So I'm Forrest Dunbar.
John Weddleton.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Dick Training.
Ira Furman.
Amy DeBosky.
Pete Peterson.
Okay. We have Dean with us. So we're going to start with the S version of the stream setback ordinance. Do we have someone from the administration who wants to speak to these changes first?
We've got more than one of us.
Okay, great. Well, come on forward. And do we have enough room at that table there for you guys to sit and talk to us?
So we're going to reserve that single seat for the laptop. Should we fire it up and look at maps and pictures, etc. But we would like to take at least the first 5 minutes of the meeting just to talk about at a very high level, the changes between the original draft and the S version that's in front of you.
Okay.
Many of you that were part of the ADU discussion will do it in a similar format. We'll just go through the comments and changes item by item and move fairly quickly. There are very few changes to go through, so it shouldn't take very long. So I will be making references to the original version when I say a page number or line number. But generally speaking, they almost all line up exactly on the S version. So I apologize for any confusion about that. First item is on page 11. And I don't know, Jeff, if you need to set up for this part yet or not, but we will go through it. If you're following along in the S version, it actually is at the bottom of page 12 and top of page 13. So I'll try and give you the correct page numbers for both sets. In table 2107-1, you will see the addition of two new rows. The two new rows that were added, which actually on your S version appear at the top of page 13, are two new stream setback, two stream setbacks specific to an area in the Anchorage Bowl that is defined as the hillside watershed protection area. The actual definition of what that means, we'll come over that later. But as far as the first changes we wanted to go over, these are the first two changes. As you'll note, what we have done here, as proposed by Assemblymember Weddleton and the administration, is we're sticking with a 50-foot streamside setback on the named streams that are within this hillside watershed protection area. And then for unnamed streams or unnamed stream tributaries, the proposed 25-foot streamside and 25-foot riparian area will apply. And as you remember from our original work session on this, both of those stream setback definitions, streamside and riparian, have different meanings. Is there any interest in us rehashing what those mean? Are you good? I'll take that as a good. Okay. Second change, also on page 13, is the addition of a new exception, number 2, or II. This is, again, dealing with the headwaters area that we're referring to as the hillside watershed protection area. And in this addition, we're allowing that the smaller lots that you see on the hill that you would find on the hillside that are platted as of the effective date of the ordinance, that they shall retain the 25-foot streamside zone setback and the 25-foot riparian edge zone requirement, not the full 50-foot stream setback. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to give greater context of what that means.
So essentially, the streamside zone is akin to what we have in Title 21 today for stream setbacks, where the simplest way to describe it is it's just a non-disturbance, really nothing's allowed in there. When we went to try to figure out how to do a larger setback, but also kind of meet the second goal of what we were charged with, which was to provide some relief to the impacted property owners. We introduced the concept of a riparian edge zone, and that is still an area that's primarily reserved for stream setbacks, but it does allow some transitional uses between the riparian areas and the upland areas. And specifically what it allows are like activities that would be considered pervious cover, meaning that like rain's allowed to soak in, and you have somewhat natural behavior in terms of how runoff that you know that either flows through or falls in that area acts. So it would allow for things like small outbuildings, sheds, greenhouses. There is some allowance for lawns. There's allowance for things like fire rings and gazebos and decks. And part of that comes out of instances over the year where we saw that people were making what I think most people would consider like a reasonable use of their property, but was not allowed under the old stream setback, whereas essentially there were no allowed uses. So there have been, unfortunately, instances where like folks have been made to move things like fire rings and stuff like that you know, probably on the grand scheme of things weren't a big deal, but weren't allowed in that outer zone. So within, as it's written in here, the hillside under current code has a larger setback. The changes here are those large lots will have what they have now, which is a 50-foot more or less non-disturbance zone. Some of the smaller lots and some of the lots that have smaller streams, like for something like not like Rabbit Creek, but like maybe like something the width of this paper, they'll be entitled to some of those lesser encroachments in that riparian area zone.
And a shortened way of summarizing is that a large setback on a small lot makes many lots on the hillside undevelopable. And so this is a relief valve for those smaller sized lots to still have at least the 25-foot streamside setback or non-disturbance zone, and then a 25-foot riparian area where some accessory uses, not primary uses, so not houses, but secondary uses can exist. And that's an addition. Excuse me. That is an addition to the document. I'm sorry, I skipped over one of the changes. It's minor. It was right above that hillside watershed protection area. We originally used the word streamside zone creek setback, and that was an error on our part, so we corrected it to the correct term, which is stream setback.
If I could just add one other thing, in terms of feedback that we got from the hillside through our outreach process that started back in November, essentially what these changes do is make it so everything within the hillside district planning area that has a 50-foot setback today has a 50-foot setback in one form and another moving forward. Whether that's 50 feet streamside or 50 feet or 25 feet streamside, 25 feet riparian edge. And that was something we heard that those residents wanted.
Great, thank you. All right, the next changes, and I do apologize, this one is actually out of order. It is on page 9 of your document. That's later in our list of changes, but somehow I got the order. On page 9, towards the bottom of your page, under section 6, stream channel alteration, item D7. The alteration does not increase the setback on adjacent properties without written permission, and this is the new addition. From the impacted property owners, this written permission shall be recorded in the Anchorage Recording District, 3rd Judicial District, State of Alaska. This addition came at the recommendation of Assemblymember Weddleton because the original language as proposed didn't actually tell you who you needed to get permission from. So if you're doing something in a stream channel alteration that will have an impact on your neighbor, you need your neighbor's permission to do so prior to us approving that. And that was a good addition from Assemblymember Weddleton. And then right below that, there is a item 8 now, or item VII. The alteration will not lead to an increase in flooding, erosion, or icing problems upstream or downstream. So that's another change over the original draft.
Chris, we have a question from Mr. Dyson.
Pardon me for being late.
No, for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, so appreciate you putting it in there so an individual lot doesn't affect their neighbors. And there's nothing that any further transfers of the neighbor's property, their situation still will not change. There's no property transfers that are affected. If it was a vacant lot or two and a developer wanted to develop those pieces of property with new construction, would they be bound by the new rules?
So, and if I can take first stab and then someone from planning can weigh in. This rule applies whether it's a vacant lot or has a structure on it. Essentially what you're saying is that by altering the course of the stream, you're also altering the buffer zone or the setback zone. And if doing so has an impact on your neighboring property, you need the permission of that property owner to do so. Unless somebody else wants to add something to that.
So for instance, and actually this suggestion, the original suggestion, as well as an example I can think of from your area, in Deborah subdivision, kind of near the dental office there, a little bit south of the microtel, there's a vacant lot there that's being developed that has a branch of the stream that used to run through like the Duck Pond car wash there. The developer there received permission from the Corps to move the stream to the northern part of the property so that they had more room to develop. And what we're saying here is that's fine, subject to whatever conditions are met. But what you can't do is you can't just get like a vacant piece of property and move the stream all the way over to one side and then, basically now have your neighbor have to deal with a whole bunch of stuff that he would not have been subject to otherwise. So the Eagle River Land Use Advisory Commission was the one who had the suggestion about getting the written notice and not, moving that impact over. And like I said, a good example is Deborah, that new houses are going in there in Deborah subdivision.
Thank you.
So I have, thank you, Mr. Dyson. So I know for the record we've been joined with Mr. Constant. I have a sort of a question or concern about the language in 8, in little 8 under B. It seems a little bit absolutist to me. So there's nothing in there that says you need to get permission. So if it creates any kind of flooding or erosion problem, even if you were to get permission from the property impacted, it sounds like that wouldn't be enough. And this language will not lead to any increase. That means any increase at all, even something that's relatively de minimis, right? As it's written, that's how I read it.
The list I through BIII are potential impacts that watershed management will consider prior to granting approval for stream alteration. So the question of de minimis or not, I think, would be in the jurisdiction of watershed management staff on a case-by-case basis.
So to ask staff, is there any case where you could alter the flow of a stream and not create some kind of changed flooding, icing, or erosion issue?
Yeah, yes is the. This is done often. There are also under the National Flood Insurance Program that the city participates in, they have a similar requirement where flooding is concerned. So every time that we do a creek restoration, make a culvert bigger, or change a culvert configuration or a bridge, there is kind of a process under the National Flood Insurance Program where an engineer certifies this. We wouldn't require that same level of certification, but this is the type of review that we're doing now. Let's say someone on the hillside wanted to put a bridge in. Mm-hmm. We're making sure that bridge that this person's used to access their property is not going to be having these types of impacts elsewhere. So maybe to put it another way, this criteria here kind of formalizes what is already standard practice when we're performing our reviews for development projects.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Studi, please continue.
Okay. The next one is page 14. Trails and street side zones. First, it's the bottom of 14, continues on the 15. Those of you that have the S version in front of you, it actually starts at the top of 15. This is section D, streamside zone, and then subsection DI, 6. Trails no wider than 3 feet and unpaved except for part of the urban stream, except for where part of an urban stream restoration project. There was a recommendation that the language we added for trails parallel to a stream should only be in the outer 5 feet of the stream side zone. This was an interesting one to discuss because typically when we think of trails adjacent to streams, many of us are picturing a Chester Creek type environment with a wide paved multi-use trail. What this section actually is designed to accommodate is the unpaved footpaths that you occasionally see as branches off of a main trail like Chester, et cetera, that people typically form themselves because they wander off the trail, but then eventually they become a little more recognized. These are designed to be narrow, tiny trails. They should not be construed to be paved or have an impact on the stream itself. And so ultimately the addition of that change, mandating that unpaved path be pushed out to the outer edge didn't seem applicable or even enforceable, really. People walk where people walk, and it ends up being adjacent to the stream, usually to watch the stream or look at fish or something like that. This is not designed to apply to large trails like Chester, et cetera.
Mr. Trainee?
Chris, I've got a question for you. Campbell Creek runs through my subdivision. It's actually platted, the people live alongside, own to the center of the creek. There is no public property there. How's this going to affect my constituents that own property to the middle of the creek? It's only one of the few that I know that are zoned that way.
Sure. I'll let Jeff take that one. That's an interesting example.
So you're right that I think your subdivision and the chain above Bird are like the only 2 areas in the municipality where people have.
Right, because I've got the flats. It shows they own the
no, they
center
very
of the creek.
clearly have the. In most cases, the state owns the dirt beneath the water, but in this case, that subdivision does. I don't really see that this ordinance changes anything one way or the other there in that while they may own the land now, they have to follow the setback rules. So other than the changes in this code versus the other, I don't really see that this changes the underlying situation there. I guess what I'm trying to say is the types of things that they were able to do now are the same types of things that they're able to do with this.
Okay.
Unless
Concerns
there's
I'm getting from some of my constituents is they want to make sure it doesn't open up the land to the public coming onto their private property.
No, there's nothing in this that would change that or even speak to that.
Thank you, appreciate it. It's an odd
good question.
subdivision because you own to the center of the creek.
Yeah, it is. It's very odd.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Constant?
Yeah, just on that line 6 there, what's the effect of the word urban there?
I'm sorry, say that
What's
again.
the effect of the word urban? Because we have a lot of areas, maybe what's the definition and how does that function?
Jeff and or Chris, can you,
I can tell you how it came to be, and maybe it was kind of that where there's a little bit of like unintended consequence. One of the, again, during our outreach that we did for this, we heard a lot from the folks in Turnigan and Bernard Community Councils about the questions about how what we're proposing would impact those communities' plans towards seeing more, maybe some restoration in Fish Creek and some opening up of like pipe sections of the creek and creating some green space. And the concern specific to this requirement that now that we're requiring like trails to be further away, they sort of thought, well, you're putting the kibosh prematurely on what we're looking to do. So that's kind of where the urban stream restoration project language came from. Looking at it now with your question, I don't know that it's dramatically different with or without the word urban.
But it could actually restrict some kind of potential use in, say, Eagle River on a creek side because the word urban is there. And maybe that's something that the folks from Eagle River want to contemplate.
personally, I consider Eagle River urban, but I grew up in the middle of
But
nowhere.
there are parts of hillside that aren't urban.
We don't consider ourselves urban.
Right, and so otherwise that would be a blank, it wouldn't be necessary, it'd be everyone in the muni,
Yeah.
right? So to put that word in there then restricts the allowance of a 3-foot wide dirt path next to a creek. And,
Would you be open to removing it? It's not a term of art, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't know, I mean, there's no like urban restoration stream project that's something in another area wouldn't qualify for, but I can see the point that like a selective reading would be like, you know, hey, you're up a Crow Creek Pass in Girdwood, you're not an urban restoration. I mean, yeah, getting rid of it, I don't, unless anyone else has any objections, I think it's.
Mr. Perman.
Sure. Assemblyman Trainey's comments, questions prompted me to think of this. There's a resolution from the Friends of Fish Creek that is making its way to the Assembly for our review that is asking to daylight Fish Creek, the portion that is currently in culverts all the way back to the library down to 42nd. What impact might this have on that daylighting or daylighting have on it?
This particular clause,
No, really the whole thing, setbacks and all that.
the same rules would apply to any portions of Fish Creek that somehow become daylighted as other creeks in town. So it would affect it, yes.
It would affect it.
Yeah. Except, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I mean, it would be, I would say that it would, nothing in here would prevent that.
Oh, yes, sorry.
And
Nothing
Nothing will prevent it.
no, and even in the prior version than the S version, there are a number of instances, for instance, in the alternate compliance section, where we added just like this urban stream restoration clause here, where we just added things that would make it easier so that 15 years from now, when it's a whole different group of players, everybody understands that this is not an ordinance that was designed to prohibit that from taking place.
And on the flip side of it, for those who own the property around that area now, would it impose new restrictions on them, or are they sort of grandfathered in? How does that work?
So Fish Creek specifically is not going to have anything different than it does now with this ordinance.
Okay.
And that's because of the level of urbanization and the amount of modification that's.
Probably right now, Fish Creek, in the pipe culvert says no setback.
It does. No, you're correct. I mean, yes, you're correct. It has no setback. And during earlier, when we were talking about the approach that we took with this ordinance, specifically thinking about things like Fish Creek or Cheshire Creek near Baxter Elementary, we could make the setback 400 feet, and we're still not getting back like the type of land cover that would be beneficial for the stream. Would just be conflicts, because we now have more pavement and roof and
Gotcha.
that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Beck.
Thank you, Mr. Perman.
The slide would be prohibited.
Okay, so any other questions on this? If not, Mr. Shi, can you please continue?
Yeah, sure. Getting near the end here. Page 19. This is in the maintenance section, talking about trees and shrub removal. Item C4, IV, we added the term municipal to that list of government bodies that are eligible for a coordinated invasive plant control project. So it now reads, as part of a coordinated invasive plant control project approved by a relevant municipal, state, or federal agency. We had left ourselves off that list, so it was inadvertent. I believe that is the last one. The definition I want you to talk about, if you keep going to page 24, I'm sorry, 22 out of 24. There are two corrections on this page. I'm sorry, there's one correction and one addition. The first correction is to the definition of ephemeral channel. And Jeff, you probably should go over why the modifications that were suggested work better.
So the original language that was in there referring to intermittent streams reflects, quite frankly, reflects like an earlier version of this. In fact, I don't even think anything that we've worked on, I think it's like quite a ways back, where intermittent streams were broken out and discussed more clearly. intermittent streams are not treated any differently than regular streams, so introducing the idea of it here is introducing a concept that doesn't really have any bearing elsewhere in the code. But ephemeral channels are called out in that table, and in many cases, what was previously referred to as an intermittent stream is now referred to as an ephemeral channel, and those are dealt with, and that does have a definition. And so something like an ephemeral channel would be like, we don't have a ton of them here, but we do have some like off the backside of Flat Top, down in Alyeska. Features on the landscape that are clear to a casual observer, carry water at some portion of the year, and then at other times of year are dry. So the term that the kind of the idea I have in my mind would be like an arroyo in the Southwest. I mean, very, very clearly, this is a prominent drainage feature that we don't want to block, move, constrict, put a house on top of, but it doesn't need the same level of protection as, Cable Creek.
Thanks, Jeff. That's the tightening of that language, and then 2 items below it, you see this is where we add the definition of the headwaters in the hillside area. We call it the hillside watershed protection area, and below that spell out the geographic boundaries of that area where the additional or the different setback rules apply. In essence, this is everything from Lake Otis and Abbott intersection go east to the mountains, to the Chugach State Park boundaries. From Chugach State Park boundaries, follow those to the southwest, where it meets up with the Seward Highway. And from the Seward Highway, it continues north back to O'Malley. And at O'Malley, it meets up with Lake Otis and takes us back to where we started. So it's sort of the entire southwest portion of the bowl.
Is this, I guess this is a question for you too, Mr. Weddleton. So I know this is motivated in part by the planning that the Hillside community has done. Is this coterminous with those boundaries?
Oddly, you find that it is.
Okay, good.
Okay, and then the final change is, on that page, the bottom major drainage way, again, going back to the ephemeral discussion, we removed the language about all ephemeral channels are major drainage ways. And I think that's it. No, that's what I think I was. Oh, I'm sorry, was it? I have it down as one. And that's it for new changes. The rest of the document stands as.
We good?
There you go.
Okay. Do we have a longer presentation as well, or?
No, if we wanted to, what I have, if we need to, is we can get into the nitty-gritty looking at maps of the rest of it, but if that's not necessary, we don't need to go there.
Is it a different kind of nitty-gritty than we did the last work session?
No, just for instance, if like Y50 on the hillside, or what,
Okay.
But if there are any questions out there, we don't have any.
All right, let's go to you, Mr. Weddleton, and then it looks like Mr. Gates, you want to get in the queue as well?
Oh,
Okay, we'll start with Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, a lot of the changes were prompted by me, and I had a list, and some of them fell off, which is fine. I'm actually very comfortable with the S version. I think it's very respectful to the Hillside District Plan. And, my experience with the waterways in general is my first house was on a pond, and paid extra for that because it was really nice being on the pond. And very quickly, Sportsman's Point developed right after I bought it, and they changed bigger houses, was basically wild land, lawns all the way up to the pond, and that pond turned into a meadow. I'm not a scientist. I don't know if it was specifically because of their growth. In fact, that was decades ago, and Steve Tobish told me just run a hose into the pond and it'll fill back up. But we lost the value of the pond. And then I bought a house, moved to the hillside, and bought a house with a creek on it, and paid more because it had a creek, and it was super nice. Prior to me buying it, someone just up the hill also bought the house on the creek, and he wanted to make it beautiful. So he stripped all the natural vegetation off, put a gorgeous lawn in there, put a little bridge over it, and somehow that changed the flow of the water, and it flooded my property. It was before I was there. And it iced over the driveway, just created havoc on this property. So when we look at these stream setbacks, you can look at it and say they're restricting my property rights. So I couldn't do things on my property because of the setback requirements. But those constraints on me were fairly minor. I'm very happy they existed because it prevents people upstream from doing damage to your property. They're critical. The stream, flows through your lawn, belongs to everybody, and the restrictions are very important on it. Are these harsh restrictions? These are extremely light. If you look at what goes on in the Kenai Peninsula, north of town, and west of Matsu, they're 75 or 100 feet. So to have 25 feet, particularly in the urban part of town, is very, very light protection for our waterways. On the hillside, when we did the hillside district plan, we went to 50 feet. And everything in that hillside district plan was discussed at length. So it was very important to the community to have 50 feet. What we've done here in the earlier version, much of it, the unnamed streams were down to 25 feet. And then we had on the other streams the 25 plus 25, which is sort of 50 feet light. What we've done here is taken the named streams, put them back to a 50-foot protected, which is where they had been both in the hillside district plan and in code when the new Title 21 was adopted. So it's not new to the hillside. The 50 feet fully protected is not new. So with named streams, in general, they're 50 foot. If they are already platted and the lot's below 50 feet, and Chris went through this, they get the 50-foot light, the 25 plus 25, because they're already platted, and maybe homes, and they may have expectations of be able to do things that if they had the 25-foot prior to the hillside district plan in Title 21. But anything platted since Title 21, the new Title 21 was adopted, had the 50-foot solid. So actually this slides them back to a more developable space. We bumped it up. The unnamed streams were 25 feet. Now they're 25 plus 25. And on the hillside with steeper slopes, more water, more damage from overflowing and drainage problems, it is important to have that extra space for all these. We also have a lot of these streams feed into Potter Marsh, and combined you have some areas in the land right above Potter Marsh where you have a lot of these smaller unnamed streams. And these setbacks are critical to protect the waterways leading into Potter Marsh. And if you go to Potter Marsh in the summer, that's a tourist attraction. We have, 100,000 people, tens of thousands a year going there. So it's not just an environmental thing, but it's economic. We got to maintain that marsh, for tourism. So those are just a few of the highlights. I'm comfortable with where this lands. It's a little bit softer than the pure 50-foot that we have now, but I think it meets some of the problems. They've had some variance requests that they couldn't meet over the years, and this deals with those. And I think it's a good workable result. So thank you.
Could I ask the administration, and I apologize if it's in here, I just missed it, but this distinction between named and unnamed streams, if in the future a stream gets a name, someone wants to name it after someone who passed away tragically, for example, and the community wants to name something, does that have a legal impact or is it stuck in time right now?
Yeah, so the name streams are listed earlier in your document, table 21.07-1, and I would have to imagine that if we named a new stream, that code would have to be updated to reflect that as well.
We actually, in the S version 2, during the discussions about what was appropriate on the hillside, and I think it was actually brought up a couple times in the testimony during the last work session, there was some umbrage taken to the concept of named and unnamed.
Yep.
So in this S version, we kind of didn't make that such a sharp divide. So if you look, there's an additional change that's on the bottom of page 12 of 24, and it speaks directly to your question, which is rather than all these other streams and then named or otherwise, what we did, we just simply went to all other streams. So if it's not a stream that's named on this list up above, then it falls into this other category. And then what we did as well is something like Campbell Creek has a bazillion tributaries to it, some of which are only maybe a couple hundred feet long, and some are a bit longer. So we don't really have a category of unnamed streams anymore. We have two categories. We have the streams that are named up here, and then we have the streams that aren't named here, and then the unnamed tributaries of those streams. So we kind of didn't have that sharper dividing line. So if something becomes like Peters Creek, well, there is Peters Creek, but, Joe's Creek, it still would not be a stream that's named on this list, so it would fall in that other category.
Good, I appreciate that, because I would, otherwise you'd have to have like a C or something along those lines for a naming action, and I think
Yeah.
that would be unfortunate.
So.
I'm sorry, we have some people in the queue. We have Mr. Gates, and then Ms. Domboski, and then Mr. Dyson. Mr. Gates?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering, these setbacks are determined from the ordinary high water mark according to the definition. How is the ordinary high water mark determined? And I guess that might be motivation timing fees rather than the main work process.
So there's a lot of guidance out there from what you'd expect, the Corps of Engineers, NOAA, NRCS, on like what ordinary high water is, and it's actually, even though it's somewhat of a subjective term, it is also like if someone's going to do an engineering analysis, they're estimating flow and width at ordinary high water. So in most cases, it's fairly easy to tell what ordinary high water is, and in practice, and now in this code, if we can't identify an ordinary high water, we're just going from the edge of the visible bank. And we're always available during development projects to go on site and help mark that in the field for folks. Watershed management.
Is that good, Mr. Gates?
I had one other question.
Okay.
I was looking at the area when there isn't a definition of stream, actually, but there is a current code definition of stream, so elaborate. I think it would be helpful if that was just included in the context in their documents.
I think these are just changes. I think that we would, these are additions and changes.
Sure.
So the definition of stream didn't change, was
Exists already.
Yeah, I see it's not changing. I think it would be helpful to...
For the discussion to have it in here?
Just the context and awareness. But, I guess it's a little too late to do that, but I don't know, everybody should dance to give the girls and have out.
Well, is the admin open to some kind of small cleanup amendment rather than another version? So we've got Chris's little change. Can we put it all in one, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there's still time, barely.
Yeah.
Trying to.
No, if we can do an amendment, we have up until Tuesday night. So.
Fair enough.
Yep. Okay. Ms. Domboski.
Thank you. So initially when this idea started to come around, I know that you guys went and talked to the Chugack Eagle River Advisory Board. Did you go to any of the community councils in Chugack Eagle River specifically?
We went to, personally, I went to the Federation of Community Councils in November and talked with both with Chugack and Birchwood Community Councils. Then, like you said, we went to Chugack. We did receive one request from Chugack Community Council, which is actually my home community council, and it was like the night before this was going there, and there just wasn't time to accommodate it. But my response to them encouraged them to speak with us afterwards if they had questions, and I've not heard anything since.
Yeah, well, and as we know, I mean, this ordinance was actually submitted in July, right? And our community councils are not in, they don't meet generally during the summer.
So this was submitted in September. This was specifically.
I'm talking about the actual ordinance. I know it went before P&Z, and I know it's been discussed since November, but what I'm asking is if you specifically went to any of my community councils and gave a presentation.
So during the planning and zoning process, yes. Since July, when it was entered into PACE and showed up in your workflow, no.
Okay, so which councils? Because I didn't see you on the agenda.
No, and I want to, when this went to P&Z, we specifically reached out to all of the community councils. The only request that we had to come speak was Chugack, and it was not. And subsequent to that, we have not had any requests.
It's okay. I'm just trying to get a feel because I actually, since now this has been introduced in July, I've gotten some kind of panic messages from some of our community councils because, as many of you know, this is probably one of the hottest topics over the past 20 years that Chugack Eagle River deals with. So whenever you talk about stream setbacks, my community takes this very seriously. And so that's why I'm trying to let you know that you know how it works through the public process. People sometimes just watch the assembly agenda. And so let me go back to the Chugack Eagle River Advisory Board because they did talk to you guys and make a few recommendations. So I just want to go back through their recommendations.
Sure.
Okay.
And if I could just clarify, didn't make my point clearly. Part of the reason this is dragged on for so long is we have tried to accommodate the community council schedule for this. And you were correct that it wasn't referring to the code, but when we introduced this sort of more or less as is, we specifically waited until the community councils were meeting in the fall so that they would have the opportunity to see it, look at it, make comments, and then still have multiple meetings before P&Z.
Sure. Well, you definitely did get, I mean, TrueGet Advisory Board, that's the reason it was created, to talk about, cross-boundary issues. So I appreciate you guys wanting to talk to them. So one of their first recommendations was in section 2107-020B 9E, and it's regarding riparian edge zones. And in here, so I am looking at it, I think where they're talking about is on page 15 of 24 in the X version. They said it should be revised to add temporary construction activity, including excavation, to the list of permitted uses activities where the temporary construction activity is necessary to the construction of a conforming use, i.e. permanent structure adjacent to a riparian edge zone. I don't see that incorporation in here. Did I just miss it?
It's in there subtly in the after disturbance associated with the uses allowed. So in the middle of for instance, with riparian edge zone, in E line 26, so it says after disturbance. So it implies that there may be some disturbance.
Yeah, that's not very clear to me at all. I mean, I read it 5 times and I didn't catch that at all. So I don't know if there was another way to make that more clear, to make it explicit that, yeah, if you have an approved use, you can.
Yeah, I hear what you're asking. I need to see their comments in front of me, but if what they're asking is to do things that aren't allowed during construction, that's a different thing than allowed use disturbances.
Yeah, I just read it, and what it says specifically is, a riparian edge zone should be revised to add temporary construction activity, including excavation, to the list of permitted uses activities where temporary construction activity is necessary to the construction of the conforming use. So what they're saying is sometimes you're in a situation where you don't have enough room. You just literally have to do things in this zone as long as it's for the permitted use.
I understand, but having been there and having discussed this with them, if you need to clear a whole bunch of stuff because you need to get a crane in to lift roof trusses in, that would be a use that's happening during construction that, might be necessary, but that's not allowed. You can't.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one. I'm hearing what you're saying. The next one, and I think you did incorporate, is to allow reconstruction of structures that are damaged or destroyed regardless of the extent. I see that one.
I thought we got all their stuff.
Yeah. And the third one, that's why I'm just making sure.
Yeah.
And the third one is, the only thing, I think you did deviate a little bit with one of their recommendations. Let me find it. It's on page 20 of 24. It looks like they're asking for, and I might be in the wrong section here, but they said it should be 2112-045A-2B, should be modified to allow reconstruction of the structure located within the riparian edge zone that is damaged, removed, or destroyed if reconstruction is begun within 10 years. And you, in here, I'm reading it as 5 years.
So the way that it read previously, there may have been two that may not have been something that we did include. Or I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I know their big concern with this section here, and a change that we did make was the version that went to P&Z had no allowances for rebuilding structures in the stream side zone, and we did change that on the suggestion that group so that it did allow for reconstruction of substantially damaged.
We'd also like to add that the normal time period for extinguishment of, I don't know word, but of non-conforming rights is only 1 year. So this is an extension beyond that.
What do you mean by
absent this particular provision in code, if you have non-conforming rights and something happens and it's gone, in order to retain those non-conforming rights, you only have a year.
Yeah, that seems a little crazy.
Well, that's not related to the stream.
No, I
but
get it.
that's
So
existing.
we won't base ourselves on what I think is bad law to begin with.
But that was the big change that they requested, and I thought it was a very fair comment. So the way they just clarify, where it used to read was you could, like, if it was burned down, you could rebuild it in the riparian egg zone, but you couldn't rebuild it in the stream side zone, with the idea being that, like, that was existing code and, like, how are we ever going to get from that?
No,
And they made a compelling argument that said, like, that just seems unduly harsh, and we agreed.
No, I think that's a good one. And I'm looking here at the note, and where I'm looking is on line 50 of page 20 or 24, where it says reconstruction has to begin within 5 years. That's where I'm looking. But I will say, it appears many of their recommendations or their concerns have been addressed. But as I said, especially now that we have an S zone, it's going to be my attempt to try to put this out till October, just so because we're already in August, so my community council can meet in September, and the advisory board has to look at the S version before action. I don't think we're in a super huge rush to do this, so I think that's reasonable, just considering how I think you might actually get buy-in versus shoving it through every perception of it. So that's going to be my attempt.
Thank you, Ms. Mbasi. We have a few people in the queue, starting with Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, I think it was sure I request a little bit of leeway. My question might be out of order, but do public entities, municipality, school district, maybe Heritage Land Bank, have to go through our land use permitting process?
I've deferred to planning, but yes.
Yeah, the short answer is yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Ms. Demboski and I have a perennial issue. So, Eagle River High School was built, huge flat roofs surrounded by asphalt. And you could sure say that we could say now that all that land was soaked up water that was coming down, and it's all gone from an area to almost a point source that has caused flooding issues downstream in a subdivision. So the question is obvious. Who has the responsibility in having produced, in essence, a stream and so on? And if that drainage plan has been proven, that or any other one, to not be adequate to control the water flows, what's the process for remediation that, to fix what becomes a problem?
That's interesting. Yeah. So that's a little bit outside of
Yes.
the topic today, but certainly PME and private development and the school district should be informed of this and part of the discussion if it's an issue, an ongoing drainage issue that needs to be addressed or remediated. I'm not familiar enough with the subject in the school drainage patterns to know how or why
Sure.
it ended up this way, but those are the entities that would be responsible.
If I may continue, and it's only an example, and everything. But does the damaged party, the downstream party, have to go into civil court for remedy?
I will defer to Becky, who I just saw in here a second ago. You restate the question.
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
If a downstream property owner is damaged because of construction that was permitted, does the downstream property owner have to go into civil court to get remediation?
Are you assuming that the downstream property owner is damaged by property by construction that was completed in accordance with the permit, or by construction that was somehow negligent or completed somehow not in compliance with the permit?
I'm not sure I heard the difference, but how does the downstream property owner get his problem solved?
I think you're correct that it would be through civil court if the issue is that again, I think there are a lot of facts at play.
Sure.
But if an upstream property owner completed construction, and I think there is some variance based on whether they completed it in accordance with their permit and thus
Right.
were not negligent, or if they did something they were not permitted to do, and
Yeah.
that's effectively violated municipal code. But yes, the recourse would be to civil court. If they completed something not in compliance with our code,
Yeah, no, I got that. Yeah. So this situation, if it's true, and maybe our district is, sometimes we hear from people, stuff's a little slanted, but if indeed it had been permitted and there's significant downstream damage, and of course in this situation would be millions of dollars to fix it, but that doesn't, and nothing has happened, maybe it shouldn't have, but we're saying that if the city permitted it, then the only recourse the downstream property owner has is going to civil court and fight against the entire municipality and the school district.
Well, it would not be a fight against the municipality. The municipality has immunity for a permitting decision. So if their argument is we erroneously permitted it, we have immunity as a municipality against permits that are issued which result in some kind of damage. I'm not sure what you're...
Can I ask a question? I'll refrain it.
Well, and do we have, what is it called, the government
Sovereign.
immunity from suit?
Sovereign immunity.
Sovereign immunity.
Against permitting, for liability based on permitting decisions. If we permit something, that's our only role in the process, and there's damage that results, we review. So
Permitting ourselves, permitting
He's
a
asking if
school.
ASD is liable. In this case, is the school, just the high school?
Yeah, it's ourselves.
Okay, so we've granted a permit to ASD.
Or-
ASD, and so ASD is acting as the constructing party. In that instance, I think they're, for tort liability, I think there may be liability. I admit, I think I'm cutting into a long-standing backwards.
We don't know enough about the particular case.
Yeah.
I don't care. It's an academic question. If we permitted it, and we have sovereign immunity, and the only remedy the guy has to go into civil court with sovereign immunity, the city or school district.
Well, the school district doesn't have liability for negligent behavior. If they negligently constructed something.
Not construction, it's the permit. It shouldn't have been permitted.
We would not. We would have immunity for the permitting decision.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. So we're going to move on. We've got Mr. Constant and Mr. Trainee, Mr. Weddleton, and Ms. LaFrance. We have 8 minutes.
Mine is really simple and quick. Mr. Wellington made a comment that was almost like he said the word bike trails. He said that Potter Marsh was used for use of tourists, and I just want to...
Important for tourists.
Yes, but the primary use I know of that is for birders and ice skaters and people who like to see the animals. But anyways, it's to be lighthearted, and now it got all serious. So
I consider it a vacation every time I go south of Diamond. Chris, Mr. Trainee.
Thanks. Did you take this to the community councils on the hillside? Did they respond? Have we got any written comments back from them? Administration.
Go ahead, Jim. I don't know, John, if I missed anything about this, you feel free to clarify. We went to, I think, 3 or 4 different, the handout I think has a slide that says who we went to, but we went to Halo, we went to Rabbit Creek, O'Malley. We went to a number of different community councils up there as well as Halo. That's maybe short of the answer. And we did just receive comments as well from landowners up there. So I believe that S version addresses most of the concerns that we were not in agreement over, or comments that were opposed to what we proposed. I think the S version addresses those.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I guess we'll find out on Tuesday.
If we get angry community councils showing up?
Yes. Thank you.
It's not necessarily dispositive about whether or not they went there first or not. But
was the question about the S version or the
S version? I just want to make sure the community councils are aware of it on the hillside.
Oh, okay.
And there have been individuals that have been engaged outside of the community council with staff over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. So we have Mr. Welton has to be taken out of the queue. So we have Ms. LaFrance and then Mr. Perman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jeff, Chris, you may have already addressed this, but when it comes to requirements for revegetation efforts, does this ordinance refer back to landscaping code where I think the plants must survive for 2 years and it's spelled out what must be done?
So I don't. This does not refer back to
like any other section of code in regards to cover. There are some specific requirements to this in terms of, you know, if you cut down something, you have to replace it with something else. But there are not any requirements. Again, if the meat of your question is, are there any requirements about like monitoring things over time and making sure that it's successful, the answer is no.
Thank you, Mr. France. Mr. Perman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Up on the hillside, I'm thinking particularly Upper Potter Valley, where I've had some experience, where initially it was undeveloped, but slowly over time it developed. Roadways were cut in, and those roadways caused initially like periodic flows down their side, and as more roadways were added to that, eventually you had ongoing flows in the side of the road. The question is, are those streams, or how are those affected, especially over changing time, as development increases the regular flow of those?
So this question came up a little bit in a different fashion in the previous work session. The presence of water alone is not what indicates to watershed management what's a stream. It has to have like a defined bed and bank, and it has to be like a flow of water that's from more than one, like it can't just be just because it rained and now there's water in the ditch. So it can't just be snow melt. So there are instances specifically on the hillside where there are streams running in the ditches, and that is because during previous development, what was formerly natural streams were kind of kicked out to the edges of the development and pushed into this thing. But there are also instances on the hillside, and I'm aware of one where the Corps of Engineers considers something a stream because it does flow into Potter Creek, but we recognize that started from like a footer and foundation drain in the thing, and we do not consider that a stream. And so when someone comes in for permitting, they may be required to whether, you know, like they want to move it or something like that. They have to go through the Corps permitting process because the Corps does consider the water as US, but in terms of the setback and those types of 21 land use concerns for permitting, we just treat it like a drainage way. So then the question is like, well, maybe it's like, why are these still streams? And it's like, you can clearly see that like it starts in a natural wetlands or it starts at a natural spring source. It goes down through some part of development, and then down below, it's back into a natural wetland, and you know, it goes to Little Rabbit Creek or Rabbit Creek. Particularly the area of like 164th, 162nd, St. James, there was a lot of kind of like less than ideal development there that push streams into ditches. And when we proposed something different than what was existing in code for the hillside, it was partially with those in mind, recognizing that when folks come to a permitting counter and they're like, what do you mean this has got a 50-foot setback? That was what those changes were. What we have here in the X version, I think, still recognizes that in some of those cases, but still affords the hillside areas protection that they wanted to keep.
Well, I'll just add one quick response to that. I think you were asking about something on the permit, which is with more development comes more drainage needs on the hillside, and you're absolutely correct. And I think that the changes that were recommended to the stream side setbacks in this area, in this headwaters area, recognize that because we have a lot of water that needs a place to flow. So while many of the drainages that you're describing on the sides of roadways are really a drainage function as part of that road project or subdivision, ultimately water is going to flow downhill, and it's important to provide not only the means for it to do so, but also, as we heard in the Eagle River High School discussion, the means for water area, for areas to absorb water as well. So that's been a central focus of this effort, is to encourage and foster development where appropriate, but also accommodate water to the best of our ability.
Yeah, this is areas that probably used to hold and retain water and let it soak in slowly, but now with the cuts through it, it moves it out, and it moves it out. It's like a stream, you know, they're small streams. And it goes right into Potter's Creek.
So if the stream's created as a development, generally we would refer to that as a drainage way, not a stream.
Okay, thank you.
If only we had some kind of unified stormwater utility. All right, with that, this work session is closed.